Thanks, everyone. Thank you for the invite to come and speak on this question. Speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then field some of your questions. I'm happy to stay afterwards and talk further. Cast your mind back if you've seen it. If not, don't worry. To the movie Calvary that came out 5 or 6 years ago, in which Brendan Gleeson plays a priest whose life is under threat, and we don't know from who. And one of the things that we do know is that Gleeson's character came into the priesthood later in life because he has a daughter, and a lot of the interactions are between him and his daughter, who's come to visit him in this remote area in the west of Ireland. And in this scene, she's talking about her dealing with depression, and her contemplating taking her own life. And she looks at her father, at Brendan Gleeson's character, and she says these words. She says, "But I belong to myself and not to anyone else. I belong to myself and not to anyone else." I think in saying those words, she simply articulates what most people think about freedom. I belong to myself, not to anyone else. Like the poem Invictus, how does it finish? You know, it matters not how straight the gate, I am the captain of my soul, I am the master of my fate. This notion of freedom is probably one of, if not the highest values in our Western society. National anthems are formed around it. Think of the American national anthem. What's the great crescendo at the end? That the flag flies over the land of the free and the home of the brave. Progress in societies is measured by whether or not a society is becoming more, quote-unquote, free. The sociologist Alan Ehrenholt puts it this way. He says, "Most of us believe a few simple propositions that seem to be so clear and so self-evident that they scarcely need to be said. Choice is a good thing, and the more of it we have, the happier we are. Authority is inherently subject. No one should have the right to tell others what to think or how to behave." And that's what we think about freedom, right? Endless choice, or put it another way, the absence of constraint. We see that as a self-evident and ultimate good. Back to the movie Calvary. In that scene, when Brendan Gleeson's daughter has said, "I belong to myself and not to anyone else," her father looks at her and he says, "True and false." It's true. It's true that individual freedoms have done a tremendous good in and for our society or the societies that you have come from. It has led to more justice, more equality for women and other minorities, and should therefore be celebrated. True and false. False is, I think, that the view that freedom is having fewer boundaries on our choices needs to be re-examined. Why should we re-examine this definition of freedom as the absence of constraint? 2 reasons. First, it is impossible and it is unjust. It is impossible to live a life that is absent of constraint, and if you try to, it is unjust. Let's unpack those both. First, it is impossible. We must limit ourselves to something. We must limit ourselves to something. You think of a man who loves to play with his grandchildren. He freely chooses to spend as much time with his grandchildren as he possibly can. And yet, he also loves junk food and takeaway. He loves pizza and freely chooses that as often as he can. He goes to the doctor for his annual checkup, and the doctor says, you need to limit your intake of pizza or else you're going to die of heart disease. The operating definition of freedom as the absence of constraint says to that man that he is free to do whatever he wants. He is free to do whatever he chooses, to spend time with his grandchildren and to eat all the pizzas. But how does that work when those desires conflict with one another? He doesn't want to be bedridden and die, in which case his freedom to enjoy his grandchildren would be curtailed. Death is quite a curtailing experience, I've heard. But he also wants to eat the things that he enjoys. So what's the answer? He can either accept the limits on his eating or he can accept the limits on his health. Excuse me. He cannot be free with regard to both. He must decide. He must decide which freedom to sacrifice for the other. The question then is not, can this man live completely free, but which freedom is more important, more valuable? This is true in our own lives. If you want the freedom that comes from having a good income, that comes from having a good career, that will necessarily mean you giving up certain freedoms now, at this stage of life. You will have to say no, won't you, to some of those evening events, some of those partings, some of the other good things that you might want to be involved in. You will have to limit yourself in order to achieve a greater level of freedom in the future. If you want to be a top performer or athlete, you will now accept enormous constraints on your life, your schedule, your diet, even where you live. You see, freedom, I think, comes not from the absence of constraint, but from freely constraining ourselves to some freedoms that really matter. Or put it another way, freedom comes from the strategic loss of some freedoms in order to gain others. Some of you may respond to that and say, okay, fine, but those are limitations that I choose. Those are limitations that I have placed on myself. To which I would say, think again, that's not necessarily the case. I think rather what you have done is that you have recognized limitations that already exist in the world, that are hardwired into reality. The reality that if you eat everything that you want to eat, you'll die. The reality that if you don't study, you won't graduate, at least not with the degree classification that you would prefer. These are limitations that we do not so much choose as submit ourselves to. So we see that freedom as the absence of constraint is impossible, because we all have limitations that we need to recognize in order to live a life that is filled with joy and flourishing. The question is not, will I live with limitations or not, but what will I limit myself to or for? Excuse me. Second, this definition of freedom as the absence of constraint isn't just impossible, it's actually unjust. It's not a good way to conduct yourself in the world. The idea is simply this: if you live your life saying, I'm accountable to no one, I don't owe anyone anything, I'm responsible to no one but myself, that can only be true if no one has ever invested in you, poured into you, done something sacrificially good for you, and if you are now fully self-sufficient? But people invest in us all the time. People sacrifice themselves for us. They go out of their way for us, don't they? It's unfair, it's unjust to say, I don't actually need you, just so as you know. I'm responsible for myself. Then someone might say, well, I'm free to act as I want as long as I don't harm anyone else. But see the problem with that. If you live a life that basically says, it doesn't matter what I do as long as I'm not harming anyone else, that presupposes that there's an agreed definition of what we mean by harm. And there isn't. You might say, well, I'm not harming you. But the other person might respond and say, yes, you are. Yes, you are. There is no agreed definition of what harm is. You see, the guy that looks at pornography every night might conclude that he's not harming anyone. And yet, it may well be that it's making him into the man who views women in these negative ways. So something that might seem innocuous, or even widely accepted, might actually, at further analysis, be harmful. Moreover, any talk of harm makes little sense without a vision for what is good. What constitutes the good for human flourishing? What is it that we should pursue positively? Only then, when we are orientated towards the correct goal, will we understand what harm is. This is the problem with thinking that freedom is the absence of constraint. It is a very negative view, because it's directionless. It doesn't give a positive vision for your future. What is the good that your freedom should be in service of? Is it an end in itself, or is it totally selfish? Of course you say, no, I don't want it to be so totally selfish. I don't want it to be an end in itself. And so I'll commit myself to my family, to my spouse, to my children, to my work, to my community. To which I say, good. But here's the thing. You're right back to where I said you would be. Constraining and limiting your freedom as a necessary consequence of wanting to be a functioning member of society. Whether it's money or success or family or comfort, something will control you. Constraint is inevitable. Everything you give yourself to, you are limiting yourself to. You have cut yourself off from a whole host of other free choices. You do this when you go out with someone. What is that act of saying, we're exclusive? You're curtailing a whole bunch of freedoms. Freedom not to go with anyone else. The only question then is, are you being constrained by something good that will lead to your flourishing, or that will end up in your with your misery? If you pursue money and constrain yourself to that end, it will never be enough. As John D. Rockefeller said, just 1 more million and I'll be happy. If you pursue power and constrain yourself to that, you will always feel weak. If you pursue success, you will obsess over your failures. If you pursue beauty, you will always feel ugly and obsess over your flaws. These masters do not set us free. They exploit, abuse, and crush us, leaving us ultimately empty. And so to our question, what if God is a freedom thief? Religion is popularly seen as the enemy of freedom. But the reality is, I hope you see, that none of us are free agents. We are all giving ourselves to something, serving something, limiting ourselves by something, or to use the Bible's language, worshipping something. What we should be looking for is not the absence of constraint, but the right and liberating constraints that fit with our nature, with the way we are made. The reality is that if there is a God, particularly a God that is attested to in the Bible, who created us in his image, then it means that there is a positive vision for human flourishing. That there is a design and a purpose in us. We come to realize that being truly free comes when we live in accordance to that reality. You see, a fish that decides to be on the land is not free, though it may have freely chosen it. It's not free. It's dying. We are built to know, serve, and love the God attested to in the Christian Scriptures. Everything else leads to slavery. But following God is living how we were meant to live. This is what Jesus attests to in John's Gospel, where he says to the people around him, if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. The objection quickly comes. So you Christians are just a servant of your sky tyrant? How is that freedom? At that point, I would encourage you to see that being a follower of Jesus does not merely mean complying to proper regulations and laws, but of deepening our affections for, growing more like, striving to know the one who loves us and has made us. It's just like falling in love. Think about it. You fall in love with someone, and what do? You seek out ways to make the other person happy. You find out those things that bring them joy and delight, and you do them. You might, excuse me. You might cynically say that you're just doing their will. It's not very romantic. I wouldn't suggest that for next Thursday. Here's a bunch of flowers, dear. Why? I'm just doing your will. It's not very positive, is it? We would never call it that. No, our obedience, our serving, our following, our limiting ourselves is motivated by love. It is a joy to us to see them happy. And so it is with Christianity. We don't live a life pleasing to God because we have to, but because we love him. We don't even live a life to please God so that he'll like us more. Because the gospel, the good news of Jesus, is that he couldn't love us any more than he already does. And that's a great motivator for love. You see, Jesus is the one who set aside perfect freedom. He is the one who constrained himself to the limitations of humanity, to the limitations of hunger, thirst, tiredness, grief, to the limitations of flesh and blood. You see, in the Christian story, long before the soldiers bound Jesus to the cross, he had already bound himself in love to humanity. He is why Christianity isn't about rules and regulations, but about true freedom. Because he did all that was necessary in his perfect life and in his death on our behalf to free us from those things that enslave, those things that promise life and deliver death. and it enables us to live a life that is truly free and to enjoy those things like money, sex, relationships, not as ultimate things to be grasped, but as gifts to be enjoyed, and to lovingly serve the one who made us and gave himself for us.